I've referenced Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, before in past messages. I think one of the topics that I spoke on was beginning with the end in mind. This may have been a couple of years ago, which is his second habit that is listed in the book. He has a gift for using biblically based ideals and kind of enlightening shining a light on a sound counsel for life. In this book, he also points out that each of us have centers. We may identify better with the term a default position. In personal counseling field, it may be referred to as your fallback position. You've heard me use the term muscle memory, which is more of a sports-related term. I like it because it aptly describes the way we react to things, maybe spiritually or mentally, just like an athlete builds muscle memory by doing things over and over and over again. And so the brain uses, synapses, develops synapses and pathways to give us an immediate response. Sometimes we say it without thinking, I did this, or an athlete just has a quick twitch reaction based on the mapping of the synapses of learning things over and over and over and over again, and hopefully the right way of doing it. When situations happen in your life, especially when you're under stress or extreme pressure or maybe caught flat-footed, surprised, there's a natural place that you'll go back to, your default position. It's where you're comfortable. It's who you are. We may not even be fully aware of where this place is and why we end up doing the things we do or reacting the way we do in challenging, difficult, and uncertain times. Stephen Covey uses a term to begin teaching to this and addressing how we might properly see and change this personal muscle memory. And I'll use that term because I like it. And he calls this principled centeredness. Principled centeredness. Now, Mr. Covey addresses the need for a personal mission statement. He says a personal mission statement, I'll read his comments here, a personal mission statement based on correct principles becomes a personal constitution, the basis for making major life-directing decisions, the basis for making daily decisions in the midst of the circumstances and emotions that affect our lives. Correct core principles empower individuals with timeless strength in the midst of change. People can't live with change if there's not a changeless core inside them. The key to the ability to change is a changeless sense of who you are, what you are about, and what you value. With a mission statement, you can flow with outside changes. We don't need prejudgments, prejudices. Our core doesn't become unstable in order to accommodate the reality we're in. So this is the section of his book that speaks to principled centeredness, our core from which all our reactions and decisions are governed by. We have an unprecedented amount of entanglements that we're tossed in front of these days. These are things that can cause us uncertainty, produce some nervousness, and even generate some fear. I want to look at some case studies that God provides in Scripture that help reveal what principled centeredness looks like in action. The wonderful thing about what God's provided us is a collection of people we can look over their shoulder, a collection of people that God has deemed his children, and we get to kind of look over their shoulder and see how they dealt with things. Now, before we do that, I want to call our attention to some of the different centers, if you will, that exist in our core. And you may identify with some, you may not identify with others. So to evaluate who I am and how do I operate and why do I do the things that I do, we need to be able to objectively realize there may be some things in our core principles that don't really belong there. Sometimes a way to describe something is to describe everything else, and then what you're left with is the thing that you're focused on. So in that way, we'll talk about a few of these things that may be at our core, but maybe don't belong there. And so self-centeredness is one. There's different centers that people have. And again, we may identify with some of these, we may not. We may identify with more than one of these. So self-centeredness is one. I don't think we have any trouble recognizing or understanding this one. At least I hope we don't. I hope we see that. I remember when my kids, I'm going to pick on my two boys here a little bit, but not too badly because they were too young to take accountability for this. But I remember when they were young, the idea of sharing, was an affront to what I want, right? For my older two boys, I remember many times when Mom would divide that last piece of cake, and it was under the scrutiny of two sets of eyes who were making sure every single crumb was accounted for. And if either thought they weren't getting their share, a catastrophe could happen, an argument could happen. And then maybe Dad got to eat the cake instead of the kids, but that was my way of dealing with that. But it's a simplistic look, if you will, at kind of self-centeredness. But I think all of us have struggled down through time in our growing up years, like Mark was talking about earlier, and I think you'll see as I go along here today that God has woven these two messages very well together. Another centeredness would be possession-centeredness. There are those who represent the age-old bumper sticker, the person who dies with the most toys wins. There are people that are often centered on possession, on things. I kind of snicker, maybe some of you are football fans or sports fans, kind of snickered because when I was playing sports, you never wore any jewelry. Well, that wasn't really ever a problem for me because I never wore any jewelry. But today we see professional football players wearing gaudy necklaces in the midst of games and those kinds of things. And it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard not to notice that they're all blinged out, and so we see quite a contrast. You see what we would deem just by the look someone that's very hardworking and takes their craft seriously, and is a plain Jane, is just there to play football. And then you've got another who may have talent and ability, but is full of bling, and it's about possessions and about displaying themselves. And so we get this contrast all the time in sports, and I snicker when I see it. So it just likely speaks to what is highly valued by them and where their character lay. Now, that may not play exactly every time, but it does kind of highlight that, this possession-centeredness. Again, money and power-centeredness. Unfortunately, we have too many representations in this current world of those that are centered on power and money. as we see world leaders such as Kim Jong-un, who has oppressed and abused his people for personal gain. He's maybe a poster child for that, but we know the world is full of those who are power hungry, those who are motivated and centered on wealth and money, and we have really a conga line of power-seeking leaders and people centered on money and wealth, even in this country. And so not hard to see that. So these centers are not considered noble, but there are centers that are more noble, that speak to higher levels of character. Maybe marriage, family-centeredness. This would be good, but insufficient. It's good to be focused and driven by solid marriage relationships, by building strong families, but should this be our principled centeredness? Luke 14, I'm not going to turn to it because I think we've covered this scripture a couple of times in the last couple of months. We know the passage. Jesus Christ said to his disciples, "Unless you love me more than mother, father, sister, brother, husband, wife, and yes, even your own life, you're not worthy of my family or my kingdom." This is God's stance on whether this centeredness, whether our centeredness is on the immovable one. Church-centeredness. This can be a deceptive one. And for many of us who've been in the church for years and years, we've seen this become someone's center. This is, again, one that can be somewhat challenging. I've seen many over the years who've confused their devotion and centeredness on the church as being principled centered, but it's not the same. The term principled centered is Stephen Covey's way, again, of expressing for us the need to always put God and his values above other values. Yet, time and time again over the years, we've seen many in the church struggle with this. Not just the ministry, by the way, but members too have had their center be service to the church, and it has caused familial havoc and eventually, in many cases, personal burnout, and sometimes it moves towards resentment and anger. So, is valuing marriage, family, and the church wrong? No, they're just inferior centers. So it's crucial for each of us as children of God to have at our center the principles and the laws of God, which are immovable and unchangeable. They never shift. They never move because of outside influences or pressure. God's principles and laws remain constant and unwavering in spite of the chaos that may be ensuing in our daily lives around us. There's a biblical foundation for centeredness, and I want to show through the lives of four individuals who were tested in different ways, in different areas of life, that principled centeredness is an action. It springs forth an action. And so we'll go through four individual examples of that. But first, let's turn to Psalm chapter 1. Psalm chapter 1. I appreciate these psalms already kind of being referenced to already. Let's look at the biblical foundation for centeredness. David begins his book with a preface statements in the first two verses, and he tells the reader who's about to read the book of Psalms where our Creator or where our center should be, and that should be our muscle memory, our spiritual muscle memory, if you will, that we should be tuned to. In Psalm 1, verse 1 and 2, it says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly." So there's three, he starts out with three negatives, and then he ends with two positives. And so he said, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord. And in his law he meditates day and night." So the word meditates, he ponders by talking to himself. Won't ask for a show of hands, but I would imagine most of us talk to ourselves. When we read the scriptures and we ponder what's being said there, we have this conversation with ourselves. I talk to myself all the time. Most of the time it's not audible again, but the dialogue is continuous. I think most of you are the same. And David said he ponders, he talks with himself concerning the law of God. And it was Paul who said David was a man after God's own heart, and God preserved that statement in Scripture for a reason, to draw attention to that. Psalm chapter 119, as Derek led us in singing this psalm, it reveals that Paul commented on, it reveals what Paul commented on, that David was a man after God's own heart. Psalm 119, verse 97, says, "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day. You, through your commandments, make me wiser than my enemies, for they are ever with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the ancients because I keep your precepts and your word." So again, God tying these messages together in this way. You know that would sound, as a one-off, that sound pretty self-centered if it weren't factual. David's not boasting about his own intelligence. He's saying, I have what I have because of you and because I'm willing to center my life on you. Now, let me make one statement that is at the heart and core of the sermon today. Principle-centered people are identified by their ability to take what other people admire in the pages of the Bible and live it. Essentially, practicing, making it part of them, especially in difficult circumstances, especially when the heat is on. Be able to resist the emotional part of that and the ability to practice what God teaches. You want help identifying a principle-centered person? It is the person who can take what is written in the pages of the Bible and transfer it into life, and transfer it into life during the most difficult times. This is where the principle-centered person really shines. When times are absolutely awful, nothing going the way they planned, everything going the wrong direction, but they continue in the right direction. We have so many examples of this, and I know that many of your brains have already brought up people that you've encountered that represent that. So let's get on to some biblical examples of principled centeredness in action. 1 Samuel 24. You know, since David wrote Psalm 1, Psalm 119, it's fitting we should start our 4 examples with him. David and his men, you know this well. I'll just try to get us into this story. This is a principled, being principally centered in the face of the opportunity for revenge. David and his men were hiding from King Saul, who sought to kill him. Saul knew David was his replacement. So what better way to keep that from happening than to take his head? And so Saul was on the hunt for David. David was hiding in the wilderness of En-Gedi, a desolate desert area, mostly barren place with cliffs and hills littered with caves. And at the base of one of the caves, you know the story, at the base of one of the cliffs near the Dead Sea, really a place that's worthless to any human in regard to survival. Only thing there was to eat was goats and rodents. Saul and his 3,000 men were in pursuit of David and his group and combing the caves and the countryside. And again, we know the story. Saul needed to relieve himself, and he happened to walk into the cave that David and his men were hiding. Not a coincidence, if we understand how God works. So one of the most difficult times to be principally centered is in those situations when revenge is the natural course that we could take against someone who has hurt you badly, someone who wants ill will against you. And when you can also justify a reaction by pointing to why you would have the right to do so. Maybe you were mistreated and it's unfairly. Certainly David in this position had an extreme in this area. Very powerful negative forces for a principled, centered person to work through. Vengeance and revenge are always deeply emotional and can really mess with your head. And when it can be justified in a person's mind, it becomes even more challenging. So in 1 Samuel 24 and verse 4, then the men of David said to him, "This is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." And David arose, and he secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart was troubled because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." So David restrained his servants with these words and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. David also arose afterward, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, "My lord, the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Indeed, David seeks your harm? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave, and someone urged me to kill you, but my eye spared you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you. Know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you, yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you." quite a mouthful for David. And I often imagine what Saul felt like. Maybe his knees were a little weak, knowing that he was that close to death. In verse 16, so it was when David had finished speaking these words to Saul that Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And then he said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dealt well with me. For when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me." This is principle centeredness at work, on display for us in the pages of 1 Samuel. We can read the words here. The words are great. The words can be noble and inspiring, but it isn't until you and I find ourselves in these types of challenging situations ourselves. Now, it may not be this dire or this exact type of situation, but it's where we have to make the choices that will truly demonstrate whether or not we are a person centered on godly principles. We all have certainly been affected by peers, and David's peer group at the height of this temptation quoted scripture to him to try to give him the okay to kill Saul. It's one thing to make a decision and listen to the advice of your friends. It's another thing when the friends are quoting scripture to you to kind of pave the way for you. And David didn't buckle to either one of these opportunities. David demonstrated principled character in the face of Saul hunting him, hunting his family. Saul had murdered some of David's family members. The rest were running for their lives. They were refugees. If anybody had a reason to take Saul's life, it would have been David. David could have fixed all that himself in one stab of the sword, but David had trained his conscience to be in alignment with God's principles. And his muscle memory, if you will, his muscle memory was centered in what we read in Psalm 1 and Psalm 119. So if you and I were in David's position, it would have been really so easy to justify taking Saul's life. It would not have taken us much effort at all to arrive at the place where we felt justified in taking matters into our own hands. We're all human in that respect. David could probably close his eyes and see Samuel with his hands laid upon him, feeling the oil running down his head and hearing the words of Samuel saying, "God has sent me to anoint you king of Israel." You know, how much more do you need to rid yourself of this evil man? And yet, repeatedly, David said the same thing. I cannot lift my hand against God's anointed. David was really so principally centered that he talked to himself, and he said in Psalm 1 that he said, Saul is God's anointed, and until God removes him from that office, I will not step in to that office. Even though God, through Samuel, had rejected Saul, remember, as king, he had passed along that God had rejected Saul. It just wasn't, God had not carried out that rejection. And so David withheld and followed God at his core. He said, I will not lift my hand against God's anointed. The icing on the cake really was Verse 16, 17, and 18, there's no higher compliment you can receive as a child of God, as a follower of Jesus Christ, than for a sworn enemy, if you will, to recognize the noble qualities in you and express a desire to have those same qualities. The man who wanted him dead recognized David's superior core principles, which David attributed, and rightly so, to his ponderings on the laws of God, him digesting and making those the center of his principles. God could not only, David couldn't only write the words, but he also could sing the words, right? He could play the words. He was talented in that way. But his heart was centered by the principles of God, and he could put them into action, even in the worst of circumstances. Well, let's move on from David's example to another biblical individual that can serve as a model of being principle-centered. This is principle-centered in the face of temptation. Let's turn to Genesis 39. There is within all of us really, as I mentioned before, a degree of selfishness. It's part of the human condition that we have to fight all the time. Our personal need for self-gratification exists kind of deep within our human spirit, and when it comes face to face with right and wrong, we have this opportunity to see whether our personal self-centeredness will win out, or the principles of God that define right and wrong will win the day. Genesis 39, beginning in verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and we know this story fairly well as well. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. And then he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all who he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. So that gives you a pretty good picture of how much Potiphar trusted and relied on Joseph. He dismissed all his responsibilities for the land he owned and the people that operated that land and his personal wealth, because Joseph was that trustworthy. And so he didn't worry about any of it. A man that certainly understood the value of trust was Potiphar, and he had placed Joseph in this position of absolute trust. At the end of verse 6, it's interesting. It says, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." So maybe the Bible's way of saying he was a stud. He not only was good at what he did, but he also looked good doing it, right? He was a good, well put together man. Let's put it that way. Verse 7, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day. So she is picking and picking and picking and picking at him, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. As with most temptations that we face in life, they're often presented to us over and over and over again. Verse 11, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men were in the house, none of the men were inside, probably a red flag that went off in his head, that she caught him by the garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. So we know the rest of the story. She told her husband, he tried to assault me, and he had the natural reaction. He tossed Joseph in prison. Does this story relate to anything we've gone through in any way? We're all very handsome men. I'll agree with that. But, being offered this tremendous temptation, we've had some time to contemplate this temptation because it was in front of us day after day after day after day. No one to stop us. If we were in Joseph's situation, no, he was the commander of that house. No one to stop him. In this scenario, again, Joseph just consistently and repeatedly acted from the principle centeredness that guided his life. For Joseph, trustworthiness held far greater value than self-gratification. What are the recorded words of Joseph? My master has entrusted me with everything he owns except his wife. It doesn't matter what I like, what I don't like. It doesn't matter what I want or don't want. He has trusted me, and I will not betray his trust. This was one part of his principled centeredness, but what was even this based upon? Back in verse 9, Joseph's last three words that make clear, really, to us as we read through this, where the pinnacle of his principled centeredness was. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? I have a man who trusts me, and to betray his trust goes against really all the principles that I live by. On an even higher plane, whether he trusted me or not, this choice would be a sin against God, and I value being trustworthy and obedient to him above all. You remember after Jesus Christ had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, we read this Satan tempting Christ. He didn't tempt him once, he tempted him repeatedly. Jesus, of course, is the ultimate model of consistency in this fashion. I think about sometimes the picture in my mind of a rock, as hard as a rock is, and as solid as it is, if it sits beneath a dripping faucet for a long period of time, that drip of water can begin to erode that rock and begin to create a little crevice in that rock. It's one thing to be caught in a bad position, kind of unawares, and have an instant correct response. but it's interesting to see if it happens again and again and again, if the response gets weaker. It doesn't take too long before it can become obvious that a person's principles are not centered correctly. Temptation, again, can be that dripping faucet, can begin to erode principle. And hopefully we can realize Satan is a very consistent adversary, and his desire is to erode our principles. Joseph's principle centeredness resisted the wear of constant temptation. His response didn't change, didn't weaken. And when it was at its worst, he did what? He removed himself. He ran. So with David, it was, what does principle centeredness look like when there's opportunity for revenge or vindication that may even be justified? In Joseph's case, what does principle centeredness look like when the option is self-gratification? No one will know. How many millions of people in a lifetime live with the shame that is created by that notion that no one will ever know, no one will ever find out? A person may actually go to their grave with no one ever finding out. Yet this doesn't appease the conscience. People will drag this anguish with them really until their last breath. I've talked to at least 3 or 4 people at the end of their life, and many times what they dwell on is those times when they allowed the situations to overcome their principles and their commitment to God. So principles, Joseph's principles, didn't erode in the face of temptation. It didn't wear over time. Let's look at a third example. This is an example of principle centeredness versus situational ethics. That's maybe a more modern term, but something I think we understand. And if you don't, we'll talk about it a little bit. I've mentioned this before. About 13 years ago, I was flown down to Bakersfield, California. Really great place to fly to. Kind of a desolate place, but to interview with an owner of a sizable industrial wholesaler that I was looking to go to work for. We sat at a table, the owner and I, and just talking about what seemed like random things, yet it was clear we were both trying to gauge each other's character, which is somewhat amusing. Did he want to hire me? Did I want to be hired by him? Those kinds of things. He suddenly jumped up and he went into his office and he returned with a book by John Maxwell, and it's entitled, "There's No Such Thing as Business Ethics." Now, strange title, but he gave me a copy. It's a small book, and he said, all my managers are going to be getting a copy of this at our meetings coming up. And he said, take this with you, and on the plane ride back to Portland, I want you to read it, because I believe you're in this book. And, of course, I was intrigued, especially with a title like that. This book pointed out that with situational ethics, there are no absolutes, no right or wrongs. Right or wrongs are determined by the situation. This book debunked this very destructive view by aligning with what, again, Stephen Covey expressed in the concept of being principle-centered. There's no such thing as business ethics. There is just ethics. You either are ethical or you're not. And ethics are not situational. There have been really more broken spirits, broken hearts, more emotional damage done in the name of, if it doesn't hurt someone else, then it's okay. This narrow-sightedness has caused a ton of hurt and damage. Actions always produce consequence, and the more you you live life, the more you realize that really every action carries consequence of some kind, and there's really no such thing as a wrong action not hurting someone. And I think, again, the older we get, the more we realize the truth of that. To a world that's kind of stuck in situational ethics, well, if no one gets hurt, then what's the problem? We go back to Daniel 3. Let's turn to Daniel 3. And the story we likely know very well. Again, these young men had the opportunity to either be principle-centered or fall prey to situational ethics, to move their principles to save their skin. Daniel 3, in verses 8 through 12, individuals that were jealous of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came to King Nebuchadnezzar, and they say, we have some Jews that you have placed in administrative positions over the affairs of the province of Babylon, who did not obey your command to worship a golden image that you erected. What are you going to do about it? So in verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar's response is rage and fury. He wasn't someone you wanted to be on the wrong side of. It's kind of hard for us these days to identify with the seriousness of this today. We hardly see people arrested for even breaking law in this country, let alone defying a government or defying some person of power. Even if someone remains in jail for trial, they could be waiting there a year or longer for any kind of trial to take place. It's hard to identify with a ruler like this, like maybe the king in Esther's time as well, where if you came into the king's presence without being summoned by him, you'd lose your head. And that would include, obviously, the queen. And so you didn't want to make kings angry. So Nebuchadnezzar gave the command to bring these three before him. What we read in verse 14 and 15 is extraordinary, I would say. The king was offering them a second chance. In just offering them this, Nebuchadnezzar is affecting his reputation and his image. And this just wasn't done. So they were getting, on top of this, they were getting a second chance. And in verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Now, any of you ever been in a position where somebody gave you a break? Maybe a break you didn't deserve. Maybe you got a break from someone who just doesn't give breaks, is known not to give breaks. Can you climb into this situation in just a small way based on your experiences and feel what they felt like? There's an emotional impact when Nebuchadnezzar says to the three of them, you should be dead already, but I'm going to give you a second chance before I make you dead. Right? Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this manner. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. So all they had to do was wait until the music stopped, bow down real quick. No one's hurt, no one's damaged, everyone leaves unscathed. And here's a perfect situational ethics setting. And in the most intimidating situation you could probably think of, you're not only facing King Nebuchadnezzar, but all of his court in the complete public eye, in front of likely the people that you worked alongside or that you governed on his behalf. Sometimes settings compound or multiply the emotional stress involved. These three were under layers of intimidation and stress. Tough to be principally centered in the face of situational ethics. Very physically intimidating setting that would allow you to kind of exercise situational ethics and then kind of escape the penalties. And on top of that, you got a second chance from a person that doesn't give second chances. Everything in your human spirit is screaming, take thee out, survive another day. You know, we look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as phenomenal examples of faith. And I would say they are. Yet I propose to you that they're first phenomenal examples of being principally centered. Because, as we know, if you look at it simply, they said, our God is bigger than you are, Nebuchadnezzar. But the biggest three-letter word in the English language. But if he chooses not to stop you from throwing us into the fiery furnace, he's still first. He's still first. But like the story, because God didn't let them burn up, we like this story because God rescued them and didn't allow them to burn. But these young men told you very plainly they didn't know if they would be burnt up or not. They didn't know what God would decide there. They just knew, burnt up or not, they were not compromising the principles that God had set in their hearts. They are extraordinary examples of principle-centeredness in even the most extreme and uncertain of situations. Let's squeeze one more in real quick. Let's turn to Numbers 20. One of the most difficult tests of principled centeredness comes when you've lost everything and there's nothing more that you can lose. You're completely abased. It's a severe test of being principally centered when everything that really counts to you is lost. I'll skim through this story because, again, another story we know very well. The children of Israel were cranky because they were wandering around in a hot desert where they apparently at this time had no water, and they wanted someone to blame for this. Per usual, when you're the guy in charge, the crankiness turns your way, and the whys and the blame game, the reason we're all in this mess, it's your fault. And so Moses and Aaron went to God, and God gave them specific instructions here. In Numbers 20 and verse 8, he said, "Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you will bring water for them out of the rock and give drink to the congregation and their animals." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. So if you went to 5 different commentators, you'd probably get 10 different opinions on what the problem is here. They did 3 things that God did not tell them to do. They struck the rock. They judged the Israelites as rebels. And there was an inference that Moses took credit, that they took credit for delivering the water. Verse 12, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. You know, I look at Moses' position, I can't think of a worse place to be. First of all, he didn't want the job in the first place, if you remember. When he spoke to the burning bush, he was making excuse after excuse after excuse to God of why he was the wrong choice for God. And God said to him, enough, you're going to do the job whether you like it or not. Moses continually complained about the heaviness of the job. He was put in charge of 3,000 continual complainers, nothing but complain. It wore on Moses. 40 years of it. The only payoff this thankless job had for Moses was that one day he would be able to place his feet in the Jordan River and walk across to the land promised to his fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then God says to him, you're never going to touch it. What kind of principles do you have when all the things you can look forward to are erased? Not there. Everything you dreamed of, labored for, sacrificed for, you put your whole life and soul into it. And God says you can't have it. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 1. We know how Moses felt about this because it's recorded in Scripture. At the end of 40 years, with everyone standing on the edge, the water's edge of the Jordan, ready to go to the promised land, and out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Moses says this to the children of Israel in Deuteronomy 1 and verse 37. The Lord was also angry with me for your sakes, saying, even you shall not go in there. So God was angry with me because of you, and he said to me, you're not going in. And Deuteronomy 4, chapter 21, again, furthermore, the Lord was angry with me for your sakes and swore that I would not cross over the Jordan and that I would never enter the good land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Let me add an element that makes this even worse. How many of you remember the account of Moses' physical condition when he died? I think he was around 120 years old, and at that age we would think of a hunched over old man, having walked as much as he walked, probably worn out looking, needing help to get around. Yet God says his strength had not left him. He had his eyesight. He was as fit as a younger man. So Moses addresses the Israelites, and he doesn't address them as a worn-out man that just can't make the trip. I don't have enough energy. This was coming from a man who was still full of life and energy. And he says to the Israelites, God swore I would never cross that river. There's a certain twinge of pain in that, isn't there? Deuteronomy 3, we get a deeper look into Moses' heart on this. Deuteronomy 3, verse 23, "Then I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do anything like your works and your mighty deeds? I pray, let me cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, those pleasant mountains and Lebanon." These words from Moses, he thought about this. He dreamed about this. This was what he was focused on. "The Lord was angry with me on your account." And again, Moses bringing this up to the people, "and would not listen to me. So the Lord said to me, enough of that. Speak no more to me of this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift your eyes toward the west, the north, the south, and the east. Behold it with your eyes, for you shall not cross over the Jordan." So God said, this discussion's finished. Moses, this discussion's finished. You're not going. So Moses was allowed to see what years of work and years of obedience had finally brought him to, only to be denied by God for what we could reason humanly as being a short outburst of anger and frustration over a people who certainly deserved a little bit of angst. Hard to have your principles remain intact and have them be your centeredness when, physically speaking, you don't have anything to lose at this point. You've already lost it all, and you're going to die on the east side of the Jordan, like the other rebels did. Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 11. I think the only way to fully grasp who Moses was and how God viewed him is to read Hebrews 11 and see the principles that was at the core of the man. Hebrews 11, verse 24 says, "By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin." This part is certainly commendable. This is a huge difference between choosing to be with your own people instead of the people who adopted you, and leaving wealth and comfort, choosing, maybe you didn't know, choosing 40 years of wandering, but choosing walking in the desert with a group of who would be very grumpy and consolable people. The key is the principle that drove Moses in verse 26. Esteeming the approach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Now earlier, Hebrews 11 declared these all died in faith, having not received the promises, but they looked for a city prepared for them by God. At the end of this chapter, it says that all of these people were waiting, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made complete or perfect apart from us. Moses' principled centeredness allowed him to look beyond a life that didn't end the way he wanted it to, and frankly didn't begin the way he wanted it to. He didn't want to be a leader of Israel. He said to God, pick someone else. And here is a list of reasons why I'm not your guy. God said, enough. You're going to do the job. You need helpers, fine. I'll give you helpers. But this is your job, and you're going to do it. Moses didn't make it hard for us to know how much the loss of being able to enter the promised land, how much that meant to him. He was very open with that. He made 3 comments publicly in the first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy. He said, "You're almost there. I don't get to go." I talked to God. He says I can't go in. I pleaded with God. God said, "You're not going." Not hard to know what was on the mind of Moses and what he longed for. It would be accurate to say that Moses was the principal deliverer. He's the one who came down from the mountain with the tablets. He's the one the people said, "Lord, we don't want to talk to you. We'll speak through Moses. Let him come down and tell us what you have said." He was, in that sense, the principal deliverer to the people. And so his actions, more than any other man in the Old Testament, truly demonstrated whether or not a person had absorbed God's principles and stayed centered on them. So 4 profound examples of principled centeredness in action against incredible forces, if you will, to try to make them make decisions on the other way. Just profound examples. So as I said at the beginning, principled centered people are identified by their ability to take what other people admire in the pages of the Bible, choose to live it, especially under the duress of very difficult circumstances. May we all strive to demonstrate principle centeredness.